I think anyone with any curiosity at all has at some point been out in nature and asked themselves the question, where did all this incredible diversity come from? Where did these millions of different species find their origins? Right? It's in our nature to ask questions about where we came from, but also where everything around us came from. And with respect to the question of the origin of species, human beings have come up with many different answers to that question on the origin of species. For example, what we'd call conventional evolutionary theory today provides one explanatory framework to answer that particular question. But there are intelligent design advocates that provide another. There are progressive creationists, or sometimes called old Earth creationists, that provide yet another answer. But not an insignificant proportion of the American population today look to something that we call creation science, or young Earth creationist, to provide an answer to this particular question. What is the origin of species, or the origin of diversity? So how do young Earth creationists respond to this particular question? Where do all the species come from? We can get a good sense by listening to seminars given at the most prominent young Earth creationist ministry, Answers in Genesis, which is Ken Ham's organization based in northern Kentucky. Here we're going to look at one particular seminar which asks this very question: what is the origin of species? As a representation of the typical position of young Earth creation on how to explain the origin of life and the origin of species. By taking a look at that particular seminar, what I hope to do is present to you a primer on the young Earth view of both speciation, mutations, and the process of natural selection. So we have that coming up. If you're a follower of my blog, thenaturalhistorian.com, or have watched videos on this channel, you know that I talk a lot about young Earth creationism. And I've talked about this topic of the origin of species, or the views of young Earth creationists on speciation. But today, what I want to do is I want to try to present their particular views in their own words, basically going through a seminar that was given just a few years ago that asked this particular question: where did all the species come from? And I want to show their particular logic, their arguments, and along the way, we'll talk about them a little bit. This talk was given by a Karina Altman, who is a Bachelor's of Science in Marine Biology and was the zookeeper at Answers in Genesis in 2019. That would be the zookeeper for the Ark Encounter. She actually gave this talk at the Creation Museum. As you can see here was the Facebook Live announcement. Where do all the species come from 2019? Creation or evolution? Where did all the species come from? An amazing variety of animals exist in the world today. Is this the result of millions of years of evolution? No. In this lecture, we will take a look at the biblical account of history to find answers to how animal species formed, as well as address common misconceptions about natural selection, mutations, selective breeding, and animal hybrids. So that is the lead-in, the catch to watching her video. She's going to explain the young Earth creationist view of an answer to where did all the species come from. Now, I don't know Miss Altman, but who the speaker is doesn't really matter, since most of Answers in Genesis speakers are simply reading off the slides or a script that they've been given and they have learned and memorized, and they go out and give these talks. The presentations are carefully crafted by just a few individuals at that particular organization, and no matter who is speaking, they're always presenting the view of Answers in Genesis, and Ken Ham in particular. And so as a result, we can safely assume that the slides that I'm going to present here today represent the latest thinking of young Earth creationists on this particular talk. Now, before I continue, I do have to provide a caveat to the statement I just made, which is that this represents young Earth creationist views, right? This version of what I'm going to call the creationist evolutionist sort of view of the origin of species that Answers in Genesis is espousing here is not completely shared by other young Earth creationist organizations. For example, the Institute of Creation Research, or what's called ICR, has a much less rosy view of the particular capacity of the process of natural selection to make new species. And we're going to see that Answers in Genesis leans heavily on natural selection as a process for making new species. Other independent young Earth creationists have proposed other mechanisms of the origin of species, and they either have a more restrictive or maybe even a more permissive view on what the role of mutations are. What they all have in common, though, is that they all propose naturalistic mechanisms to explain the origin of present-day species. Not necessarily the origin of the original organisms, all right? We have a supernatural explanation for that. But for the present-day diversity of the variety of species we see today, they propose naturalistic explanations to get from the origin of organisms to the present-day species. All right. Well, we're going to have to unpack that as we go, but I'm going to let Karina Altman actually do that for us, so that I can present as much as I can in the words of Answers in Genesis. Okay, back to the main feature. I've taken a series of screenshots to provide a summary of the young Earth creationist answer to this question: where did all the species come from? I will show those screenshots in the order they're presented and provide some commentary along the way of reviewing as a way of reviewing the young Earth creationist understanding of speciation. Let's get going. Altman begins her talk with the standard preliminary remarks about contrasting views and seeing the evidence through the correct, remember, biblical eyeglasses. All right, having the right biblical worldview is the only way to understand this difference between a secular or atheist worldview and their biblical worldview. It's always a setup of a dichotomy between there are only two positions: their position, the right position, and the wrong position, the world's position. She then asked where species came from and begins to introduce the audience to the opposing worldview, that is, the evolutionary explanation for the diversity of species. Her characterization of evolutionary theory is really critical here, since it's going to contrast with the creation model she's going to present of the origin of species. In particular, the idea that life came from non-life and the statement that changes in organisms are undirected will be especially important going forward. So we see, if we go to the figure here, we can see that what are her main points here? For what she thinks that evolutionary biologists believe is that life came from non-life. All life has a common ancestor. Changes within animals are, again, undirected. That word is going to be really critical here, undirected. Animals evolve into different animals, right? And her terminology for that's going to be kinds evolve into different kinds of organisms. In other words, large amounts of change happen. And then lastly, modifications result in entirely new structures and animals, right? So that whole new body plans and whole new body systems can evolve over time. So that's her presentation of the basic tenets of evolutionary theory. Now, back really quick to the directed, which is going to be contrasted with undirected, right? Creation is going to be a directed process, whereas she sees evolution as a undirected, random process. This is probably the strongest wedge that she's going to drive to force the audience that she's talking to into one of two camps. Either all life is undirected, has no guidance, no direction, no purpose, all right, is sort of the implication underneath all that. Or it is this directed, guided thing, all right, which has an endpoint and a goal. So it's atheistic evolution or young Earth creationism. Those are the choices presented to the audience. But are these properly framed options? I don't think so. But let's stay on task for the moment and look at how young Earth creationists are selling their version of evolution to the audience. So after setting the table by defining evolutionary theory and presenting some of the problems with it, the young Earth model is going to be introduced. And from my reading and talking to many young Earth creationists, I think this set of statements here provides an accurate summary of what most young Earth creationists understand about the origins of biological diversity. So, for example, we have life came from life. The original animals were created 6,000 years ago, hence the young Earth creationism. Changes within animal kinds are directed. So now here we see a direct contrast with the undirected nature of evolutionary theory, at least in their minds. And no new animal kinds have evolved, right? Different kinds. We'll have to speak a little bit about what a kind is. And modifications occur in structures that already exist. So now you see this word, modifications, that things that existed at the beginning, at the original creation, can be modified over time. But those modifications are really just minor tweaks to the system. You can change little things about organisms and create some new minor characteristics, but not major characteristics. Now, where the boundary between a minor tweak and a major tweak is never really defined very well. But again, we're going to talk a lot more about that in a moment. So let's take a look. Let me explain in more detail a couple of these points where Altman, or I guess we really could say answers in Genesis. What are they saying? What do they really mean when they say some of these phrases? So, for example, life came from life. What exactly are they talking about here? You may be wondering that. Life came from life. What does that have to do with the origin of things? So this is being contrasted with evolutionary theory. And what they're doing is they're contrasting it with the idea that life came from non-life, right? That the origin of life itself must have come from non-living things. And so they're saying, in our case, we believe that life came from life. Altman says that God made life, and thus life came from life. Well, yes, God made life. And since God is alive in some sense, it isn't wrong to say, from her perspective, that life came from life or was made by life. But isn't it kind of an odd thing to say? I mean, does a plant or an animal or our being alive really the same as God's life? Are his traits of being alive or not alive analogous to ours? I mean, after all, is our cellular metabolism, how is that related to his being alive? Right? One of the common things we consider of all living things on Earth is that they're composed of cells, right? That they utilize energy in a certain way, right? That they have a form of hereditary system, right? An information system, right? Contained in them. Is Altman and Answers in Genesis suggesting that that same form of life is giving rise to life? That God is composed of these same types of things and is giving rise to us? That we have the same kind of nature? I don't think so. And so that to me is kind of a stretch to say that life came from life. But what's even more interesting about this is I think that this statement is contrary to the Word of God itself. Right? I think God tells us that life didn't come from life in this sense at all. In Genesis 1:25, God says, "Let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds. The livestock, the creatures that move along the ground, and the wild animals, each according to their kind." One could hardly say that the land was living and so gave rise to life. After all, if the land gave rise to life, that wouldn't be any different than what evolutionary theory posits, right? That life came from non-life, that it came from the dust, right? From the substance of the physical universe, rather than from God's life giving life. So what about, and also before I continue, what about man? All right, in Genesis 1:7 says, "Then the Lord God formed a man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. And the man became a living being." Now, Altman might find a connection, right, here between God and man's life in that God breathed into man. But remember, even though it uses that word breath of life, most Christians, I think, generally agree that this isn't referring to God making Adam's cells start to function. All right? This is usually taken to be the origin or endowment of the soul, right? The nephesh portion of man's life. The image, or even the image of God, placing the image of God on man. There's a variety of different thought on this, but for the most part, it's not about the physical living portion of Adam, but it's something about his nature, all right, that's being endowed upon him. We are told that man's body was formed from after all, we are told that man's body was formed from the physical substance, the non-living matter of the earth. So I find this very first point, that life came from life, rather uncompelling, all right, for the young Earth creationist. So what about the statement, changes within animal kinds are directed? All right, how about that third phrase there? Altman claims that unlike the conventional evolutionary model, which he claims involves no direction, just randomness, the young Earth creationist model asserts that all changes in species are design features God placed in the genetics of these creatures at creation. So let me read that again. This is actually a quote from her during her talk. All changes in species are designed features. So the changes that actually happen to species and ultimately making new species in the creationist model, they are designed features that God has placed in the genetics, or we might say has placed in the genome, all right, has placed that information inside of them, in their cells of the creatures at creation. So when God created originally, right, in this orchard model, you have the kinds of organisms, the basic sorts of types of organisms on Earth. And she's showing only animals here, but this would be true for plants and other organisms as well. That there was a creation de novo, supernatural creation of the kind of organism. And in that organism was placed, right, all the information and the features they needed in order to change, adapt, and so forth in this new world. All right, so she's suggesting that the features we observe today, all right, the characteristics when we look out in the world and we look at different organisms, the features that we're observing that help us distinguish one species from another, all those were present in the original creation. And each of those features was directed, or I guess you could say guided, to their present configuration during some time, since the creation. All right, she's saying, and I know all creationists believe that the original organisms created on the earth on the sixth day, in this case for animals, didn't look exactly like the animals that are alive today. There have been changes since, but those changes have been somehow encoded and directed by God since that point of creation. All right, so that's a huge contrast she's setting up with the evolutionary model. Now, it gets a little more interesting. After claiming that the changes within animals are directed, we go to the next slide, right? Because now we're going to be told, how did that direction happen? At least I think that's what she's trying to say. I've listened to this several times, and it's actually unclear how she's making this connection. But she has said that all changes are directed. And then she moves to, how did it happen? All right, what is the origin of species? What is the mechanism of that change? And so how does it happen? You might be surprised that the way that God directs changes in species is via what? Natural selection and mutations. And she also lists selective breeding, and new species are always being formed, but there's no new kinds evolved. It's kind of like, all right, so natural selection, mutations, and selective breeding are resulting in new species forming. There are species today that are distinguishable from one another that didn't exist in the past, at least exist as separate species. They somehow existed contained within a single individual or a few individuals. And so the caveat at the end, the last bullet point is sort of like, okay, yes, yeah, things change and there are new species, but there's some kind of stop limit to it. They can only go so far. No new kinds of things can evolve, right? Cats can't like change into dogs. Would be the typical thing, and that, in fact, I think that's the thing that she actually said. So how does the change happen? She's saying it happens via natural selection and mutations. Yes, this supposedly non-random directing of changes from one species into multiple species. After all, like two individuals got off of the Ark just 4,350 years ago. And those two individuals then, their descendants changed into 35 different living identifiable species that are alive today. That's a tremendous amount of biological diversity, especially if we toss in maybe another 100 extinct species that have existed since the flood, but have gone extinct before the present day. That's a lot to accomplish. And how is it accomplished? According to this slide and her way of speaking, right, and explaining this, it's accomplished via the processes of natural selection and mutations. Although she has a question mark there, she's going to use mutations as a source of information for creating variation within kinds that can be used to distinguish different species. So yes, young Earth creationists are claiming right here that the variation necessary for all natural selection was created at the beginning, except for some new mutations, which is really confusing, but we'll get there soon enough. But she takes that variation, and it's that variation that she needs to get new species. And here it's being described completely in what? Naturalistic ways. Right? She stops talking about direction at this point, and she's just talking about observations and natural selection and things we observe happening in the world around us. And she's describing them as if these are things that are happening as natural forces. This suggests that God is making, or means of making new species, can be described to natural mechanisms. And since they're natural mechanisms, we can explore them scientifically using scientific methodology, right? We can study those mechanisms. So we can say, like, here's how this mechanism works. And I can make predictions about what will happen if you apply this particular what happens if mutations happen and natural selections happens in a particular environment. I can kind of predict what will happen to species into the future as a result. Now, if you don't think that young Earth creationists are ascribing creative capacity to the processes of natural selection, let's just take a look at the next slide. Because here she tries to define natural selection. So here she's going to define natural selection. And she defines natural selection as, natural selection is a non-directional process where organisms possessing certain characteristics survive better than others in a given environment or selective pressure. And you can see the result of that process is that if they survive better in an environment than other individuals in the population that have different characteristics, those individuals are more likely to have offspring. That's really the most important part of this is they have offspring. And if they have offspring, they're probably going to share some of those same characteristics that they have with their offspring, therefore making the next population that replaces the previous population, it's going to reflect those survivors, right? Their genetics are going to reflect the survivors, and therefore the next generation will be more like them and have characteristics that better fit that particular environment. This is a reasonable description of natural selection. Now, most evolutionary theory or evolutionary biology textbook is not going to use the word non-directional process. I mean, these are words that young Earth creationists use because they're constantly trying to exhibit and promote a divergence between their view and the evolutionary biologist's view. And so they're constantly bringing up this directed versus non-directed, which I think is a meaningless thing, which we're going to get to right here. It's this distinction. They're saying that it is non-directional, but can result in changes to organisms that make them more fit for the environment. How is that not changing an organism in a direction? All right, if probably we don't really understand what directional means here. She never provides a definition for non-directional versus directional, or something directs something, right? That's another word that's been used several times here, is that God is directing things. And so she's trying to point out that this is so confusing. The natural selection is a non-directional process. But prior to this, she said that what is God's means of making new species in the world today? He uses the processes of natural selection and mutation. But she said that was a directed process, because she's contrasting the young Earth view, which is everything is directed, with the evolutionary or secular worldview, or really what she's trying to say is the atheist view, that it's non-directed, God doesn't exist. But then here she comes along and says that natural selection is what is being used by God. But what is natural selection? Natural selection is a non-directional process. Yeah, you should be as confused as I am about the use of these terms. These terms, directional and non-directional, they're just so vague and mixed with the use of directed earlier in the talk that we can read almost anything we want into them. But I think that that's kind of the point. The Answers in Genesis audience isn't going to be confused about this at all, right? At the Creation Museum, hearing these words, I think they're really powerful. They're going to just hear these words, directional and non-directional. They're not going to see that she's mixing the two, she's conflating the two together at different times. They're going to see the idea that, well, God is sovereign and powerful and in control, and there's a plan for each species, since God knows and has determined their future. Likewise, the audience has been trained to believe that evolution is equivalent to atheism, and therefore evolution requires there to be no God, and there's no possible direction to what will happen. And so she's just constantly playing off of that particular theme. But as I just pointed out, she's confusing the two ideas of directional and non-directional as she's talking about natural selection. Biologists studying natural selection would agree that natural selection doesn't have a goal, right? In the sense that it's striving for something, or natural selection doesn't have a mind. It doesn't have foresight, right? It doesn't have forethought. It's not looking to the future and asking what this organism needs in the future. However, that doesn't mean natural selection is powerless to change organisms. We still speak of natural selection as shaping organisms through time. For example, if the environment gets colder, you can expect that this process of natural selection is going to do what? Select genetic combinations or variations, or you want to say traits in the population, in conjunction with some new mutations. We'll get to mutations later, that have some adaptive advantage in that colder environment. Some individuals are going to have characteristics that allow them to survive better in that colder environment. And therefore, they're going to survive and have more offspring and pass those particular characteristics on to their offspring. That's going to change the population over time into a population that is more adapted for the cold. And we would see that as long as that environment stays very cold or continues to get colder, what would we look at that population as having done? We would look at it as having moved toward becoming more adapted to being adapted to being in a cold situation, right? That end point is to become more adapted to the new environment. And so in this case, the environment is deciding, right, the direction for which genetic change is going to happen. Right? Now, I'm not using the word environment as some kind of, as anthropomorphically. It's just that the environment is the conditions, all right? The the air in the room, the amount of moisture in the soil, the amount of sunlight that exists in a particular location. That's the environment an organism exists in. And if that environment changes, natural selection is going to move that organism's characteristics into a state which is more adapted to that newer environment. And that's going to look like it's moving it in a particular direction. All right. But that's different than saying that has a forethought. It doesn't make those changes before the environment changes. Right. And in fact, an individual doesn't even make the changes when the environment changes. It just happens that there's variation in populations. Natural selection is selecting on the variants and saying which of these variants that exist are best fit for this particular environment. So it's the presence of variation that's really critical. And of course, we're going to get to the fact that where does variation come from? Well, variation comes from mutations. And so mutations are really the driver of the creation of the variation for which natural selection is going to select. All right. Now, you may still be confused. I'm still confused about just what do young Earth creationists think this natural selection thing is and what it's doing. How is it non-directional and yet completely directional at the same time? For young Earth creationists, natural selection is somehow non-directional, but yet is being described as being responsible for guiding and directing the evolution of new species. Now, I think in the way that I just described it a moment ago, you can see how it does and it can make new species because populations move into new environments. Natural selection will sculpt and shape and select for traits that are best fit for that environment. That's going to cause the organisms to change their appearance and their functions over time. And therefore, separate populations that move to different environments are going to become different enough that they're going to become different species over time. And as I said, I feel like that is a way of describing it as being directional in the sense that it's not random. Natural selection is not a random process in the sense that it results in collections of traits that are better fit for an environment, and that's predictable, right? That's not random. And I would say it is directional in some sense. Well, maybe the speaker has something else in mind when she says changes are directed. And maybe she's getting confused with what the term directional means here. Right? God, in his plan to fill this entire world with diverse creatures that are adapted to this world. Remember, in the young Earth creationist viewpoint, the original world was very different than the world today. The original creation, very different. Then you have the fallen creation between that and the flood. That's a different world. Then you have the flood, which completely landscapes the entire earth. After the flood, you have a very different environment because you're going to have an ice age. And then after the ice age, you're going to have different environments yet again. And so the present day world is very different than the past world. And so you could say that God had a plan to fill the entire world with diverse creatures, but he understood they were going to have to adapt to all these new conditions. But at the end of the day, let's ask ourselves, it is difficult to say how what she's describing here is any different than how an evolutionary creationist, a theistic evolutionist, might actually describe the origin of species. Actually, it's hard to even say how her description is any different than what an evolutionary biologist would say, other than the rate at which it occurs, right? I mean, they only have a couple thousand years. Evolutionary biologists would say natural selection is a really powerful force, right? Natural and mutations are important, but they don't happen that fast. It can't speciate that fast. But nonetheless, from the perspective of just describing how the mechanisms work, it's hard to see the differences between what a young Earth creationist is saying here and what a evolutionary biologist is saying, especially when you strip away the idea that, especially when you delve into what exactly you mean by directed. How is God directing this particular process or not directing? Is there really a huge difference between utterly God not involved versus God involved here? Okay, I didn't put that well. We'll come back to that. We got a lot more to say about this because this is really the nub of the issue here, is this whole aspect of what is meant by directional and randomness and all this. And it's really about how is God involved? And it's really about thinking about what do creationists really think God is doing? Like, how is he actively involved in this world in the present day? And those are big questions, not just for young Earth creationists, but for theists overall. Okay. Now, here comes the thing. All right, let's keep talking about this, because she's not done trying to talk about natural selection. She claims that natural selection can't bring any new information into the world, right? So if evolutionary biology says that organisms went from simple to complex, well, where did the complexity come from? All right, much more complex organ systems, for example. And since natural selection, she claims, can't make those things, evolutionary biology can't be true. And so let's talk about that. She says natural selection is not evolution. Evolution requires the creation of new genetic material. And the implication here is that natural selection can't make new genetic material. Therefore, since evolution requires that, natural selection is not evolution. And natural selection decreases or eliminates genetic material. So these are three things she believes about natural selection. Well, in fact, natural selection is not actually evolution. It's not actually change. It's a mechanism for change. And as a mechanism, it's just one mechanism for changing organisms over time. It doesn't happen to be the mechanism that has been suggested as a mechanism for adding new genetic material. There's another mechanism for how genetic material is added to an organism that has been proposed, part of mutations. And so that's not part of natural selection anyway. So this is a rabbit trail that she's a typical thing that is said at Young Earth Creationist talks. So she says natural selection can't make anything new other than what, and then where did that variation come from? In her mind, where did it come from? Well, that variation existed already in the kinds at the very beginning because God made the kinds. But think about this for just a moment. Even if we grant, despite it being scientifically unsubstantiated, that there was an enormous reservoir of genetic variation in the created kinds, say like canine kinds or feline kinds, Young Earth creationists are still claiming that it is what? Natural selection that chooses combinations of genes and alleles in organisms, making them change into distinct species that are adapted to different environments. How is this God's direction? How exactly is this God directing the formation of species? Even if the variation is present, how does it result in that information being turned into new species? Is God using some kind of natural means to achieve an end? And if we were to measure and study and describe this process of natural selection, what are we doing? Are we actually identifying how God acts in the process? And how is this any different than what, say, an evolutionary biologist might describe the mechanisms of natural selection? How is this different than how a evolutionary creationist, who believes that God is involved in control of the aspects of this world in nature, how is that different than their view? Again, I have to say, this is all very confusing. So you're not wrong if you're confused. I mean, part of that's me, and how I'm trying to describe this. But I'm trying to work through my own confusion about the positions of Young Earth creationists about natural selection. But it does make me wonder, exactly what do they think God is directing, all right, in natural selection? If they want to distinguish their particular view from other views. In this slide, all right, we see that the common charge that natural selection doesn't make new information, but rather decreases or eliminates variation, right? That's another thing that she's claiming. Let's touch quickly on one other point that she's making here, or trying to make in this slide. She's making the common charge that natural selection doesn't make new information, but rather, what does it do? It decreases or eliminates variation. And again, she's trying to say this because it makes it sound like, oh, see, evolutionary biologists don't have a mechanism for creating new information. Natural selection, which they say is what evolution is, which we already said that's not equated directly with evolution. It's just one mechanism of evolution. Hey, it doesn't create variation, so therefore they can't explain that. And in fact, it's even worse than that for them, because natural selection decreases and eliminates variation. Yeah, all right. That's mostly true. But they're wrong to think that evolutionary theory says that natural selection adds information or creates information. Since it doesn't, that's the role of mutations, which we're going to get to next. And in fact, she's going to talk about mutations next, actually adding information to genomes. So it's like, it is kind of frustrating, all right, to see her lack of understanding. And when I say her lack of understanding, remember, she hasn't written and composed this particular talk. This is script that is written for her by presumably experts at Answers in Genesis, which are reviewing and putting together these talks for their speakers to go out and give. Natural selection does actually generally get rid of variance, right? It's very good at selecting against bad variants, things that aren't best in the particular environment. And if selected over a long period of time, they can actually select them right out of the population. And so, yes, variation is lost through natural selection. There are mechanisms in natural selection that maintain variation. And I don't want to go into those, but it's generally true that natural selection weeds out variance, and there is a loss of genetic variation from populations as a result of the natural selection process. But there's always something adding new information, which is mutations at the same time. So if you thought that the creationist view of the origin of diversity was confusing to this point, based on the descriptions here of natural selection, buckle up, because next we're going to look at mutations. All right, now we see the familiar mantra that mutations do not result in a gain of information. It's going to be repeated and repeated and repeated and repeated again in young Earth creationist literature, as if repeating it so many times just makes it true. Right? Here she says, what is a mutation? It's a permanent change to the DNA of an organism. It's any change in the genetic material is a mutation. And by the way, that could be individual changes of individual bases, A's to T's, C's to G's. But it could also be the mixing around of chunks of genetic information. It could be the duplication of genetic information. It could be the loss of genetic information, right? All those would be mutations because it's a change to the DNA of an organism. Now, but then she makes the second point. It is not, see the huge bold not, it is not a gain of information. They're going to argue that's always a loss of information. But then interestingly, bullet point 3, there is no mutation that results in a gain of new information, of new genetic traits required from molecules to man evolution. She's saying you would think you wouldn't have to say that, because if there's no gain of information, well, then the third point is obviously true. The problem is, on the next slide, she's going to talk about how there are actual beneficial mutations, and so that for that is a change that creates a new trait. But she's going to try to say that's not new information. Right? I told you, it's going to get more confusing. All right? So despite the fact that you hear all the time that there's no new information, you can't gain information, and mutations are, well, typically the past year, mutations are always bad, there is a hint at a shift in how young Earth creationists are talking about mutations. I've seen it over the last decade. They do acknowledge that mutations do contribute to the variation we see within a kind, and that mutations may result in differences that allow us to distinguish different species. Right? So after saying that the variation is sort of front-loaded in the original created kinds, she's going to go on to admit that there are some variants that we see between, say, different species of dogs, or especially between dog breeds, that those variants didn't actually exist in the original kinds. And if they didn't exist in the original kinds, where did they come from? They had to have come into existence somehow. Now, rather than her saying that they came into existence supernaturally, that God just made them, right, and supernaturally directed them, she points to mutations. She points to mutations occurring, and she's even accepting that those mutations are random errors that occur. I don't like the word random, and I don't think that she should be using the word random. I don't think Answers in Genesis should use the word random if they're going to say that everything is directed. But nonetheless, let's not go there. That's a very long, involved discussion as well. Evolved discussion. The new way of talking about mutations by young Earth creationists is that they exist, right? They admit, yes, mutations happen. They can hardly deny that they don't happen. But they'll say they don't add new genetic information necessary to make new traits. Okay, you got to read that carefully. You have to understand what they mean when they say new traits. They mean no new body plans, no new organ systems. They can't. You can't take an organism and add a new leg with mutations. All right, but what can be done with mutations? They may add variation to previously existing features. So, for example, if you have an arm, you might actually increase the length of the fingers. You might change the color of the skin. You might add more hairs to the arm. You might change the texture of those hairs on the arm. You might add more sensory organs by in development, making more. All right? You might change the metabolic rate of some of the cells and how they're breaking things down. You might, again, scale the body size of a whole organism. All right? These are changes to features that already exist. I can change, if hair already exists, I can change the hairs into different types of hairs, the numbers of hairs, the colors of hairs, and so forth. So they don't consider this new information. See, they're defining information now in such a way that information becomes, I guess, a whole bunch of information, or like novel information for making novel features, like a whole new program, essentially. Like you got a whole set of genes that are completely new that make this whole new feature. But if you already can make a feature, you already have a lung, you already have an arm, you already have a head, right? You can alter those things through mutations. So they don't consider this new information. They just consider this tweaking genes that already exist. So the total package of genes, or programs for making traits in their thinking, all those, like all the major genes for making the parts of a kind, they're all placed in the original kind. So no new programs can be created, but the programs themselves that exist can be altered in ways that make the appearance of new traits. Now when I use the word trait there, I'm using it differently, because I'm using it in the sense that young Earth creationists are using it. A new trait there would be, yes, you could have a skin color, or you could have a feather that's brown, but now it's white. All right, you can have hair that's short, but then hair that becomes long. And maybe in the original creation it was never long, and they never had that trait before, but you could alter that particular program, and now you can make long hair. All right, these are presumably still parts of God's directed plan, because because mutations were part of his plan to make more variation that could then be selected by his other part of the plan, which was natural selection, as a process he put in place to select upon these characteristics in particular environments that would adapt them to those new habitats. All right, so you put it all together, what do you have? You've got mutations are occurring all over in genomes of all different organisms. They're mutating programs, and some of those mutations result in new characteristics or new variations of those traits. And some of those new variations give an adaptive advantage in new environments and therefore will be selected. And so that organism will have a new characteristic in that new environment that never existed in the original organism itself. So the entire information set necessary to live in that new environment didn't exist in the original organism. Do you see how young Earth creationists are talking about random mutations and non-directional actions of natural selection? They're saying natural selection is non-directional. She has that on the slide. It's a non-directional process. But they're still saying it's all guided by God. Really, how does this differ than the theistic evolutionary argument or the evolutionary creationist argument? The only difference is timescale, as far as I can see. And if God is guiding the process, why not say that he can add new genetic information by way of mutations? I mean, mutations are allowed to change programs and create new traits that can be adapting organisms to new environments. What's to stop God from, at the same time, adding new programming information to organisms? Now, when I say that, what I'm actually doing is I'm kind of actually slipping into the progressive creationist model. All right, the progressive creationists or old Earth creationists believe that the world is old, billions of years old, and that organisms have come into existence over different times. And God has, in many cases, added new programs to organisms such that when new environments formed over billions of years, God added significant new genetic information, allowing organisms to adjust, to have new features for those new things. But that's a supernatural, I guess you could say, intervention or addition that can't be explained via natural processes. What are the young Earth creationists doing here? They're not actually explaining anything in a supernatural sense. They're trying to take what God made in the original creation and say that everything that happened since can actually be explained by scientists. They are creation scientists after all, right? As a creation scientist, I can observe the world and I can come up with mechanisms to show how God has used those mechanisms to affect and create the types of biological diversity we see today. Now we get to the really difficult part here. We got to talk about these beneficial mutations. And I've been making it sound like young Earth creationists believe that beneficial mutations occur and they are important for shaping organisms and creating species over time, but they really haven't fully embraced that in the way that I kind of described. So they are forced to admit that beneficial mutations happen. They can't just say that all mutations are bad, even though they might say that mutations are happening randomly and that should be breaking down the genetic code, the perfect code God gave organisms at the beginning. It would seem like mutations should be bad. And it was tempting and always has been tempting to say that mutations are always destroying genetic information because they're destroying or changing what God made, what was perfect at the beginning. And so how could anything that changes God's perfection be considered beneficial or good? But they really can't deny that there aren't beneficial mutations, but they have a workaround. They again stress that mutations aren't adding new information in the sense of new programs. And they'll say that most of them are causing losses of information. And they'll even say that what looks like beneficial mutations are actually losses overall of God's original information. But the loss in a temporal sense or a temporary sense or in a local environmental sense can be viewed as beneficial. But it's not universally beneficial. Now, what do I mean by this here? All right, so the example she gives here is, you see there on the screen, it says, all mutations, even beneficial ones, right, in quotes, beneficial, are a loss of variation of pre-existing genetic traits. Now, this actually, I don't think this is a true statement by any means. I could give many, many examples in which the variant is not a loss of pre-existing genetic traits. But the examples that young Earth creationists always use of beneficial traits are in fact losses of existing traits. So for example, she's going to use the example of albinism. It's really easy for, I think, audiences to understand, especially genetically naive audiences. She'll say, here's this bird, which is normally brown, and it matches its environment. And so therefore that's a good variant for that particular bird. But then it has a mutation, and that mutation causes it to lose the ability to make pigment. And so it's white. So what is she claiming? She says, like, well, the mutation knocks out the ability for the organism to make pigment. So therefore is losing genetic information because it was a gene that functioned and now it doesn't function. But the loss of function, right, can be considered beneficial if the white mutation, the bird with the white mutation, happens to be in an environment where it's a lot whiter, all right, or if it migrates to a snowy environment, right? If it migrates to a snowy environment, it will be less visible and hawks won't kill it as easily, and therefore it has a better chance of surviving and having offspring and having more white offspring. And so what could you say? You could say that the white allele, the gene for, the broken version of the gene, is actually beneficial. Now, they'll still go and say, like, well, that's a broken gene. God's original creation meant for the birds to have brown feathers. But in this broken world, in this world with new environments that weren't exactly God's original plan for the world, it's necessary for birds to sometimes have white feathers. And so if they break their original variation and they become white, well, that's a beneficial mutation for them in this particular environment at this particular time. And you see how they're going to limit it to a beneficial mutation is just sort of beneficial here and now in this particular location at this particular time. Now, the mutation does confer an advantage, right? Because why? Why would we say it's an advantage? Because natural selection, right? Because of the process of natural selection. Natural selection's deciding. Again, deciding doesn't mean like it has a mind. It's just the way that nature works. All right, the properties of nature, that we could say that God has created the world with those properties. It will decide, all right, that the white allele is better than the brown allele in a particular environment. All right, so young Earth creationists say this is just modifying an instruction set. It's modifying an instruction set that already existed. And so this doesn't count as new information. This doesn't contribute to evolution. Right? But you have to remember, when they say evolution, they mean molecules to man evolution. That's always what they mean. They don't mean that birds becoming other bird species and adapting to new environments. So a bird living in a tropical environment moves north and then gains a bunch of characteristics and now is adapted to winters. They wouldn't consider that evolution. They would consider that just tweaking genetic programs. And that could happen through mutations and selection of variation that already exists by natural selection. So they use this, what's called a loss of function example, and those are easy to illustrate. The albinism thing is easy to illustrate. It's a loss of function example. And they say, and these are their favorite examples because they believe this demonstrates that the degradation of the genome, which they call genetic entropy, and she doesn't talk about genetic entropy much, but other creationists talk about genetic entropy, the fact that the genome of all organisms is basically falling apart from its original form. What they don't tell their audience is that mutations can change the function of a gene such that it forms a new product that has a new use and therefore becomes a new trait. Right? If you have a gene for making hair and the original version is short hair, but now you alter that particular gene and it makes longer hair, that can have a benefit in a more northern environment. That's not a loss of function of the gene, right? That's a change in the function of the gene, and it confers a new function, which is heat regulation, all right? And so And then there can be many, many, many other cases of this where you're going to have, you can have cases too where you have genes that maintain their original function but also take on a new function. And they might have two functions where they had one before. All right, so they don't tell their audience about these types of things because they sound more like you're adding new features and functions to organisms, right, and making new traits. When confronted with such cases, young Earth creationists will claim there still isn't any new genetic information. They'll still claim, well, you already had the gene, right? That gene was still a gene from the original creation, and all you're doing is tweaking that gene. And even if that gene comes up with a new function, that still is an original program that you're just changing that program. And so therefore you haven't added a new program. Like you can't add a whole new gene or several new genes. You can't add sets of programs to things. All right, so by not wanting to acknowledge that beneficial mutations could add truly new things to organisms, they've created a new category. Right? They've said, yes, beneficial mutations happen. There's all kinds of new variations, and these new variations can have importance, but they're going to actually add a new characteristic. All right? And you see this, they say it's, I need to go to the next slide here. Beneficial mutations, right? She has a slide. Beneficial mutations. They exist. Some mutations are unique, but not truly beneficial. Okay, so they're saying beneficial mutations are real, but beneficial mutations aren't truly beneficial. What the heck do we mean by that? Some mutations have beneficial outcomes, but only in specific environments. And so they've created a new category, a new way of talking about this. And the way they talk about it is they have a new category called truly beneficial. All right, you see the word truly there? They're not truly beneficial. They sound beneficial, they seem beneficial, but they're only beneficial if you look at them a certain way in a certain environment. And then they claim what? That evolutionists have to have and demonstrate that beneficial mutations, truly beneficial mutations, actually exist. But let's ask ourselves, what in the world do they mean by truly beneficial mutation? You should be asking yourself, what do they mean? How would you define a truly beneficial mutation? For young Earth creationists, it seems that these are mutations that always, under every circumstance, increase fitness in every single organism that they occur in. That to them is what a truly beneficial mutation is. So let me give you an example, or read you a quote from a young Earth creationist blogger named In His Image. He defined beneficial mutations in a very similar way. Here's how he defined them. He said, in order for a mutation to be beneficial, and we could read that as truly beneficial now, it must have no drawbacks, no negatives. Trade-off mutations do not advance the cause of evolution. He states, for evolution to proceed in its upward trajectory. All right, so there's a misconception in itself. Evolution is somehow always making more advanced organisms. And it must, right? That it has a goal in mind. It's a teleological thing. It requires completely beneficial mutations. And completely is the same word as truly here. That under every circumstance, there can't be any drawbacks to this particular mutation. There can't be any negatives. You can't say like, it hurts this, but it helps this, and the net positive is the net result is a positive benefit. No, there can't be any negatives to this at all under any circumstances. This statement is so chock full of misconceptions about evolution. But to stay on point, let's focus on it must have no drawbacks, no negatives, no trade-offs. All right, I agree that truly beneficial mutations, by this definition, do not exist. Right? By using this definition, creationists have made beneficial mutations impossible. But this definition has no basis in reality. Right? It's utterly nonsense. It can't exist. So it makes it easy for them to say that they don't exist because, yes, they don't exist and they really couldn't exist. Not at least in any type of not in this present reality. right, that God has made for us. Is there any allele of any gene that always increases fitness and has no drawbacks or no negatives? I can't think of one. There's not a single trait of any organism that possesses that always is positive in every individual in every species. Right? The value of every single variant, whether you want to think of them as being created by God in the very beginning or created by mutations, which are determined by the context in which they exist. A brown fur allele is a beneficial mutation in a grizzly bear. But the exact same allele would be a negative fitness effect if that grizzly bear were to live in the same environment as a polar bear. Right? You see, so brown fur on a grizzly bear is not a truly beneficial trait. It is a beneficial trait in its environment at its particular time that it's living. Right? In this particular environment today, on the earth, in this particular year, in this particular location, brown fur is better than white fur. But if the environment changes and all of a sudden it's much, much colder, right, the polar bear is going to have an advantage in that particular location over the grizzly bear. And that you wouldn't say that brown fur is a truly beneficial trait. And so if one is a mutation, which white hair is probably a mutation, it is beneficial in a particular environment and not beneficial in others. And I don't care what trait you think of. You can think of a trait for me, any trait, and ask yourself, is this trait always? Does it never have any negative impact? Every trait I have, many of those traits have positive influences on my existence right now. They all have some negatives to them. I mean, each of them requires energy for me to maintain, right? So that's, I have to maintain them. That's something I have to deal with. It's not 100% positive thing. I have to maintain those particular genes and I have to feed them energy in order to make them work. But that's at a very basic level, how no gene is always positive. But I have lungs. They're awesome for breathing air. But if you throw me into outer space, I'm going to wish I had different alleles for doing something different because I'm not going to be able to breathe the air of outer space and survive. That's going to be a negative, right? Those genes don't mean no good. They are not positive for me in outer space. Neither are they if you push me under the water in my pool and I'm not allowed to breathe air. I'm going to wish I had gills rather than lungs. Right? It is always dependent on the environment. And so if you go back to their definition of beneficial alleles, well, yes, some mutations are unique and some have beneficial outcomes in specific environments. That's true for every single allele. That's every single one. They're only ever going to be beneficial in particular environments. So, this would even be true all the way back in the original creation, right? Organisms had particular traits. They lived in particular environments. And if they moved to a different environment, if you took a fish and threw it out on land, actually, I don't know how the economy would work, the environmental economy of the way things worked back then, because if a fish was made to live in water, but you took it out of the water and put it on land, but death doesn't exist for, say, vertebrate animals. I don't know how it survives outside of that, apart from a miracle. But then we're way outside the bounds of being able to explain things through natural mechanisms. And as you can see, what we're doing here is young Earth creationists are explaining how organisms have diversified and changed through natural mechanisms. Mechanisms that God has provided, but natural in the sense that we can describe their operations through mechanisms and means that we understand. Right? Not through supernatural mechanisms or a separation of the ordered way that the universe works. A favorite example, let's go back to mutations for just another bit. I'm just going to keep working this idea. A favorite example of a mutation that is not truly beneficial, to give an example, is antibiotic resistance in bacteria. All right, creationists claim that this mutation that confers resistance of bacteria is beneficial. They'll admit, that antibiotic resistance is a beneficial mutation, but it's only beneficial in a specific environment. Totally agree. I absolutely agree with that. That environment is the one in which the antibiotic is present. Absolutely. If you take away the antibiotic and you have two bacteria living in a world with no antibiotic, the bacteria that's making the antibiotic, all right, to resist the biotic, the chemical in the environment that's trying to kill it, and that particular chemical is not in the environment, that bacteria is at a disadvantage, right? Having antibiotic resistance is a disadvantage to bacteria if they're living in an environment where there is no biotic that's trying to kill them, because they're using extra energy. It'd just be like me having genes that I'm not using. I would have to have the energy to maintain them. I'd be having to maintain them even though I'm not using them. And so the bacteria that doesn't have the antibiotic resistance genes is at an advantage in those environments. So they conclude that since it's not always beneficial, it is not a truly beneficial mutation, and therefore can't result in evolution, since evolution needs and requires mutations to be truly beneficial. Well, that's a bunch of hogwash. All it needs is for a mutation to be beneficial in a particular environment and have that environment exist for a long period of time. Because as long as that environment exists, that mutation will still be beneficial. As I said, this definition of truly beneficial doesn't mean anything and is only meant to sort of protect the young Earth creationist from having to admit that mutations can have a dramatic effect on organisms and can alter their programs and adapt them to a very extreme environments. They want to allow them to make minor tweaks, but not big enough tweaks that a kind of organism could actually shapeshift or change into another type of organism over some period of time by having the environment influence that over long periods of time. No one thinks that mutations that are truly beneficial exist, and every evolutionist and every evolutionary biologist agrees that mutations can result in a positive fitness in one context and be a negative or neutral have a neutral effect in another context. They all agree that antibiotic resistance is only helpful in some bacteria, but the same mutations are negative on other bacteria. So remember, the variant or the allele, the genetic variant of a gene, which young Earth creations seem to think is the original created variant, has negative fitness value in the presence of antibiotics, right? If they're going to claim that the original bacteria didn't have antibiotic resistance, because that's not a truly beneficial allele, there are going to be instances where that bacteria is going to be living in an environment where they need antibiotic resistance, right? They need to resist those biotics. And in that particular environment, their original allele is a negative fitness, right? They're going to die, even though that was their original created condition. All right, so even in the original created condition, there are no truly beneficial variations by their own definition. There's no possible allele in the original creation that benefits that organism underneath every single possible environment they could be put in. You'll always be able to find an environment in which the particular characteristic they have is a net negative characteristic, has negative value. All right, let's get to some conclusions. Let me read these off for you real quick. God created all animal kind 6,000 years ago. And she hasn't actually defended that particular argument in the talk. That's just a given. All right, that's an assumption because of her viewpoint of how to read Genesis. And she's talking to an audience that will have that assumption built in. Every kind started with animals that had vast genetic potential. So she's going to argue that every kind had built into it a bunch of genetic variation. That variation could therefore be sorted and selected for in the future in different environments that would eventually pull different individuals apart into separate populations, which we now call different species. And she's going to say those are directed somehow, but without, as we've seen, telling us exactly how that direction happens, because she's going to explain it all as the process of natural selection, which she's going to say is a non-directed process. Confusing. And interestingly, here we see that Noah had fewer than 6,800 juvenile animals on the ark, representing 1,400 kinds. That's why young Earth creationists need to come up with some kind of mechanism for creating all the different species we see today, because they say there were only a few species, just 1,400 different, we could call them species, ark species, just 4,350 years ago, preserved on the ark. And those two individuals of each species that got off the ark had to then become the thousands and thousands and thousands of species we see today. So they diversified, changed into a lot of different species. And that's what they're searching for, is the mechanism to explain how that happens. And they're not going to explain that as God supernaturally creating species, because the original creation is done on the sixth day. He's not coming in and supernaturally interfering in the process in the sense of stopping natural processes and just snapping his fingers and saying, okay, now there's a coyote where there wasn't a coyote yesterday. And now I'm making a African wild dog that suddenly appears on the African savanna. No, young Earth creationists accept that every animal that's in the canine kind, the 35 living species, all find their descendants. They're genetically tied. They have historical ancestry with the two dogs that walked off the ark. And since they do, they have to find some natural process for explaining how they became all the different diverse things they are today. Hence the appeal to natural selection and mutations to explain that process. So we have here confirmation of their present thinking, that there were a very few number of species or land animals on the ark, and that those hundreds of species have been created since the creation are the product of starting with genetic potential, sprinkling in a few mutations to create some variety, some additional variety, and that then potential becomes dozens of felines, dozens of canines, dozens of primates, and so forth, and all by natural selection and mutations. We've also learned that this genetic potential doesn't necessarily contain all the genetic variants, and they needed to give us today's genetic diversity. They expect that some of the programs for making cats, they would expect that the program for making a cat-like thing is the original program. But all the different variants that make the specifics of different cats aren't necessarily all found in the original creation. Most of them were. All creationists still talk about massive genetic loading at the original creation. Lots of variation. But nonetheless, they'll still talk about, maybe having a little bit longer hair, or this particular color patch, or like having a floppy ear in dogs, right? They ascribe that to mutation. Like that wasn't part of the original creation. There's a mutation that causes a floppy ear in a dog versus an ear that sticks up, right? And much longer hair, or hair that never falls out. Like my dogs have hair that doesn't fall out. I have to cut it, or it'll become a very negative fitness characteristic for them if I never cut their hair, because their hair will literally not allow them to see or walk around at some point. Right? And those are the results of mutations, but they are new traits, right? We'd say like my Old English sheepdog has traits that no other dog has ever had in the history of dogs in their ancestors, right? So the descendants have new features. They have new characteristics that never existed in the original creation. And what you've seen in this talk is she's working really hard to say that, yes, there are new traits, but those traits are losses of genetic information. They're not truly beneficial. I mean, your Old English sheepdog not being able to see, that's not truly beneficial. It is a new trait, but it's not truly beneficial. And I would agree, because there is no such thing as truly beneficial traits. Yeah, so we can change, the programs. We can tweak things according to young creationists. Now, the challenge, of course, is how much can you tweak before you change something so much, you change an organism so much? Is a fox different enough from a coyote that they're different kinds? Or are they the same kind? And how much will they change in the future? Where's the stops? Like, how much more change can they endure without becoming something different? These are the challenges for young Earth creationists. So there you have it. It's really simple. For the young Earth creationist, what is the origin of species? Right? What is the origin of species? Descendants of original kinds experienced genetic reorganization, modifications by mutations, and were subject to a process we call natural selection. That process chose the variants, the mutations and the original variation, that best suited new environments that those organisms were living in, changing those organisms over time into groups of individuals we call populations with enough genetic differences between populations that live in other environments that we're easily able to discriminate them as being different species. They even become incompatible with each other, where they can't sexually reproduce anymore. They become so different from each other. I feel like I've heard something like this somewhere else, all right? Not from creationists, all right? I've heard this particular explanation. Just read what's on the slide here again. It's the same thing I just said, but let's read their words. As each of the descendant generations became isolated after the flood, they formed new species. Right? As they became isolated, one's moved north, one's moved south, one's moved to jungles, one's moved to the high plains, one's moved into deserts. And as they did so, they became isolated. And as they became isolated in new environments, they got selected for different traits, and they formed many new species. What is the origin of species? Changes via what? Natural selection, mutations, selective breeding. Selective breeding is just human beings that are able to intentionally pick out characteristics. And so we have adapted and sculpted a lot of species on Earth for ourselves, all the dog breeds. Are all the reasons for the diversity today. Read that last bullet point there again. Read it again. Natural selection, mutations, and selective breeding. And she doesn't say, and other things. And she doesn't say, and God's direction. She just says, natural selection, mutations, and selective breeding are all, A-L-L, all reasons for the diversity today. Now, I just emphasized that that was really important. I just realized that I could read that differently. These are all reasons for diversity today. I guess you could read that as, these are reasons for diversity today, but they're not all the reasons. Each of these just is a reason. There could be other things as well. All right, so I won't be as strong on that point as I sounded. All right, nonetheless, I'm left with some questions. And the main question I'm left with when I hear talks by young Earth creationists is, where is God in the process? How do they insert God into this process? Where do they see God's action? How does God interact with this world today? Not just at the creation, what did he do in creation, but what has he been doing since? This presentation honestly felt deistic to me. All right, despite the statement that changes within animal kinds are directed, right, which would be a non-deistic statement. It's saying God is actively involved. He's directing this process of making new species. Nonetheless, God is portrayed as what? As placing all the variation. He's front-loading all this variation into the original creation. And then it sounds like he's letting it all play out. I have this program, I pre-programmed everything, and I'm just going to let now the processes play out. But there's the confounding factor here for me. It's one thing to say, like, you're going to run out your programming and I know exactly what every step is going to happen. Like I've programmed everything so that this will happen, this will happen, this will happen, and this will happen when this particular thing happens. This little lever will be tripped at this particular time, and so forth, right? And that would still be a somewhat deistic way of viewing it, as opposed to God being actively involved at the very moment, moment by moment through time. But there's a complicating factor here. That programming would also be affected by mutations somehow. Where does the action of mutation come in? Are mutations directed by God to tweak the program? Because there's the original program, and then God adds a mutation that says, no, we need this feature now, or we need to change this feature in order to get this new characteristic for this new environment. So are mutations an added value characteristic, an added created effect? Young Earth creationists don't want to say that. They don't want to have new creations after the original creation. On the other hand, they want to, and they also have this thing where they're pointing to mutations as being typically normally bad. They usually do refer to them as being random, although I don't think they should be using the word random. I don't like the word, the idea of randomness for a bunch of theological reasons. Don't want to go down that route very far. I'm trying to wrap this up. But the whole genetic entropy thing, I got to say something about that really quickly. There's a bunch of young Earth creationists that are pointing to genetic entropy, the fact that new mutations are accumulating in the programs of organisms, and they're actually destroying organisms, making them less fit for the environment over time. And many young Earth creationists predict that human beings and all other living things on Earth are basically doomed to extinction because eventually their programs are going to be run into the ground and broken by mutations. And yet the flip side is that here we're seeing that mutations can cause variants that create new species, or the variations that distinguish new species over time in different places. Yeah, so it's not clear if they believe that these mutations are random, they're pre-programmed, somehow directed, what else? They're not describing the action of God here. They're not, what are they doing? They're not leaving a place for God. So I don't ask these questions without having my own answers, but rather I ask these questions because I wonder if young Earth creationists have really thought about these. I've thought about these types of things a lot, and I have a lot of ideas. But do young Earth creationists know what they're proposing here? Have they really thought about how God works in this world? Have they asked themselves if their answer to where did all the species come from is any kind of improvement, or really all that different than what other Christians who believe species were formed over much longer periods of time, but through the same processes? Are they really distinguishing themselves from evolutionary biologists or evolutionary creationists? I'm not sure they are. Yes, there's the rate thing. There's the original creation. But in terms of the process of making new species, is there anything distinctive about the young Earth creationist model of creating new species from previously existing species? I'm not sure that there is, but I'd welcome anyone's response to that. Well, thanks. I hope that is a primer of the young Earth creationist perception or views of the origin of species and how species might have formed since their original creation. I know that it's not clear because I don't think that they are clear. I don't think they've really thought through all these different issues, and it's very difficult for them to present something that is an all-encompassing view. But I think that this particular presentation does present all their assumptions very, very well and sort of lays those cards out. And so I look forward to seeing how they respond in the future, and if they ever think more deeply about this particular topic than they apparently have to present. All right, I'm going to quit there. That's it for me. We'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.